Well, my dear Romeo brothers, it's an honor to talk to you. The Romeo, for those who don't know, is retired old men eating out. You Romeo brothers are Bible students. You've been followers of Jesus for your whole life, most of you, and listened to many sermons and Bible studies. You're also able to study the Bible on your own. And that's a good context for what I'm going to share. Why Jesus called her a dog, a biblical study in racism. Now, what is my background regarding this topic of racism? Do I have any credibility? Well, perhaps a little. My childhood was in East Palo Alto, which was in the 50s, a mixed neighborhood. And neighbors around us were Black, a few white families. And Reggie Smith, my next door neighbor, was a Black guy who was my best friend. We dug dirt forts together. His mother, Artemis Smith, was a good friend of my mother. And we spent a lot of time in those early years, kindergarten, first, second grade, just bonding and being friends. Later on, I became a Christian and then a youth pastor in my early 20s and was part of planning a church, Crossroads Bible Church, and my mom was also a member there. And there was an incident in which Mrs. Green, my mom, introduced the family of the Browns, who were Black, to the Blues, who were Black. And then we also had a couple called the Blacks who were white. And so she was introducing people to each other, and we just joked about how colorful we were on many levels. And it was a good fellowship, a good camaraderie, and a blessing to be a part of that church in the early 80s. And then I went to seminary because I was preparing to become a missionary. I felt God's call to go to the Muslim world. And so I needed some preparation. While there in seminary, I actually did a theology paper on this very story, these passages in the Gospels. And Don Richardson was my inspiration for this. He was a missionary statesman, wrote Peace Child. They made a movie out of that too, about his life story. He worked in the Irian Jaya among a very, a cannibalistic tribal group, and his story is quite amazing. But then he also wrote a book called Eternity in Their Hearts. And it was in this book that he wrote a whole chapter about the story of this Canaanite woman and Jesus. And I really liked his solution proposed, but he didn't really give it a lot of biblical support. It was an interesting proposition, but I wanted to dig into it and defend it. And that's what I did in seminary. And when I finished the paper and they gave me a good grade, an A, and they, wrote some good affirming notes about how it helped the professor's own position on this, well, I sent it to Don Richardson, and he was very pleased and asked permission to share it when he taught his seminars. And this was in 1983, and he offered for me to co-author a book with him, a sequel to the Eternity in Their Hearts book. And it was a very great honor and a temptation at that. But I declined because I was training to be a missionary, and I didn't want to just write about things that I hadn't experienced, and I wanted to go. So I actually became a missionary to a little country in Bahrain, an Arab context, and went through a process of bonding and became bicultural over the next few years. And that was an interesting experience. I'm not going to delve into it, but the cross-cultural dynamic and being a minority in another culture was quite an experience, and I treasure the experience, including the hardships involved in that. It helped tenderize my heart, I believe. While I was there in Bahrain, sometimes I would watch Saudi Arabian television that was broadcast. It was kind of a propaganda channel, as you could imagine, and they were trying to, in English, reach out to the expatriate community around there. And they, one of their favorite speakers on that program was Dr. Jamal Bedawi. He was actually based in Canada at St. Mary's College, but his website now, you can go and listen to many of his talks and videos. I tried to find the exact video because I came across him talking about this very passage in the Gospel of Matthew. And he used the passage, which we'll read in a bit, he used the passage to make the following points. First of all, he defended the prophet Jesus. Muslims honor Jesus as one of the great prophets. And he defended Jesus in the following way. He said that Jesus would never speak this way to another person, to a woman. And therefore, this is an example of Bible corruption. The Bible is corrupt. That is a teaching that is heard among Muslim scholars quite a bit. And this to him was an example of it based upon the character of Jesus as a prophet, that a prophet, any prophet, wouldn't have talked this way and called someone a dog or insinuated that their people were dogs. And then he went on and quoted the higher critic Christian scholars, which were turn-of-the-century scholars, most of them who were also very, very critical of the integrity of the texts of scriptures. They've since been discounted because of textual criticism, so-called lower criticism, but the textual criticism has shown how reliable the Bible really is. But he was quoting the ones that agreed with his position. He also went on to say that Jesus, although a great prophet, was limited in his scope. And he quoted what is known in theology as the exclusivity logion, which is one of the statements Jesus makes. It's, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That's the statement. And so he offered that as proof that Jesus was limited to Israel, but Muhammad was a universal prophet, the final seal of all the prophets, the common Muslim perspective. Now, I've worked with Muslims now over 30 years, both from Bahrain and more recently with the Afghan community here in California. We've had a lot of interfaith meetings, and I've actually used this passage to honor Jesus. And I think as a follower of Jesus, it's my job to present him and as accurately as I can to the scriptures and to defend the integrity of scriptures, which is what I'm going to be doing now. But one thing I don't do is attack Muhammad or Islam. I try to find common ground. And they do try to honor Jesus. I think as a follower of Jesus, we should be doing a better job of that. So there might be a little tension there, but the point I'm making is about Jesus, not about Islam. Now, I call myself a recycled missionary because after 9/11, I was drawn back into working with the Muslim community, but now here in California, I have made several trips to Afghanistan over the years since 9/11, but my focus is called bridge building between our faith communities, and that's what I've been doing. And that's the context that I'm sharing this in. Now, the story is found in two of the Gospels, Matthew and Mark. And it's interesting that although they're talking about the same incident, that they hit it from different perspectives and they don't contradict, they kind of help fill each other in. And so I took my cues from some other biblical scholars that blended them together. They call this producing a harmony of the account. So this is the complete text of both Matthew and Mark that is shared with colorization to show which was the source. And if it's black text, it means it's shared. Both of them have those words. And it's an interesting experiment to do. It helps you to see the whole story better. I'm not going to read it right now. I just wanted to point out that we're going to get into it at that depth. But first, I want to give a little background about what are known as the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic refers to the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which share a lot of common passages. They're synonymous, if you will, synoptic. And in fact, it's quite remarkable that over 3/4 of Mark's content, his is the shortest one of the three, is found in both Matthew and Luke. And nearly all of Mark is found in at least one of the other two synoptic gospels. This is the triple tradition. And then Matthew and Luke have material in common that is not found in Mark. And so the whole picture is found by including all three, and in fact, even including John. But our story fits into the synoptics, and combined, the way I showed you, the total words are 279. Not very long as a story, but only 48 of those words, 17%, are in common, the black text that are shared between Mark and Matthew. And so Matthew has 116 words, the blue ones, and Mark 115 words. Synoptic, like I said, are the ones that agree, but John is the final gospel. He was familiar evidently with the others. He didn't repeat any of that material like they shared with each other, and he completes the whole story. These authors, some of the authors, evidently knew of each other's works, and they freely bothered. They didn't have problems with plagiarism and things like that. They borrowed, edited to fit their purpose. And what was their purpose? Well, Matthew, now I'm really giving you a quick overview here, but I believe it follows the book of Acts in terms of how they came into being. The book of Acts, you're familiar with it. I'm glad I'm talking to a group that's biblically literate. You know how Acts starts with the early church, and they were comprised of Jewish background outsiders, kind of like the followers of Jesus, that like the disciples, like Matthew. He was an outsider, a tax collector, and he wrote to that community, and it reflects a Jewish emphasis. Mark, on the other hand, is known to write to the Roman audience, and he's also, according to church historians or church fathers, they attribute this to Mark, who was Peter's companion, a scribe really of Peter. And so my belief is that this was prompted by the new church that started with the Roman Cornelius, the centurion, and the newly formed church in Acts 10. I think that provided the perfect opportunity. Peter was involved, Mark was involved, and this would have been a good executive summary for a centurion. Now, there's no absolute proof of that, but that, to me, follows the flow of the book of Acts and makes sense that Mark wrote to the Romans. Luke, of course, was Paul's companion, and it says at the beginning of Luke that he compiled collections of the accounts and made it an orderly presentation to this person named Theophilus, who was evidently royalty. He was given a royal title by Paul. And so I think that this was actually King Agrippa, who's mentioned in Acts 26 when Paul goes before him and says, you know, Agrippa says, you will, in a short while, you will make me a Christian. And Paul says, I wish you were, only without these chains. And so that's my theory, that Theophilus was the person that Luke was kind of the catalyst to bring his gospel and, of course, the book of Acts together, maybe to help defend Paul in his trial. Who knows? But to me, it makes sense. It's not the only way that looks at it. Actually, most scholars put Mark first and think that Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark because so much of Mark is in the others. But I think it happened this way. That's my perspective, and I'm not going to go to the mat on it, but there it is. And John, of course, wrote to the whole church. So now let's look at Matthew's account. Matthew is the blue, and of course the shared text in black. So I'm going to read it from Matthew, and here it goes. Jesus went away from there into the district of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that region began to cry out, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed." But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and implored him, saying, "Send her away, because she keeps shouting at us." But he answered and said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." That's the exclusivity logion I mentioned. But she came and began to bow down before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on crumbs which fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "O woman, your faith is great. Because of this answer, it shall be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed at once. That's the whole story from Matthew. Now Mark, same story. Jesus got up and went from there into the region of Tyre. And when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. But after hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit came out and immediately fell at his feet. Now the woman, a Greek of the Syrophoenician race, began, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he was saying to her, "Let the children be satisfied first. It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs." Then Jesus said to her, "Because of this answer, go. The demon has gone out of your daughter." And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having left. So there you go, both stories. And now the combined, see how it flows. And this to me is a sign of its divine inspiration, even though they're two authors from two perspectives, even though they knew of each other's work, or one of them knew about the other one. I think it was Mark that edited Matthew and gave Peter's personal perspective as an eyewitness, but in any case, let's read it as a combined account. Jesus got up and went from there and withdrew into the district of region of Tyre and Sidon. And when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. But after hearing of him, a Canaanite woman from that region, whose little daughter had an unclean spirit, came out and immediately fell at his feet. Now the woman, a Greek of the Syrophoenician race, began to cry out, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed." And she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and implored him, saying, "Send her away, because she keeps shouting at us." But he answered and said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and began to bow down before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he was saying to her, "Let the children be satisfied first." And he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs which fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "O woman, your faith is great. Because of this answer, it shall be done for you as you wish. Go, the demon has gone out of your daughter." And the daughter was healed at once. And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having left. Combining them gives us a little more complete story, and it's probably still very abbreviated. It's interesting in the common text. Most of it is not common, but in the common is the black text, which I've highlighted here to show that the statement about Jesus and the dogs, using this slurous term dogs, is the common text to both of them. So it's evidence how strong this was. Now, the problems that come from this story. The big problem is, was Jesus a racist, especially by today's standards, but really by the standards of his day? Was that a racist slur? Did he infer that the Canaanites were dogs? Was he ethnocentric, provincial, exclusive, only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, as he said? And that's a very strong grammatical statement, that it was exclusive only, not anything else in Matthew. Was Jesus unkind or even rude when he answered her not a word? The only time in the gospel accounts that Jesus ignored someone that's mentioned in the text, that he answered her not a word. Did the humanness of Jesus trump his divinity here? Did the woman change Jesus's mind? These are all, the problems that the text were the scriptures corrupted. Was Dr. Badawi correct, or the higher critics correct, that some racist writer put these words in Jesus's mouth? That they aren't true scriptures from the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but there's some corruption to what actually happened, what actually was what Jesus said and did. Those are the problems, and they're very relevant for today. In studying the Bible, you guys know, you start with, what does it say? And you determine, is this really what it says? Then you ask, what does it mean? And finally, you say, well, so what? How does it apply? And we're going to do that. Maybe not all today. This might be part one. So there are proposed solutions that I discovered in my research over the decades of this passage. Since I first wrote my paper, I've been continuing to study and keep up with the subject. And I summarize them in 5 proposed solutions, groupings. There's the testing solution. I give it the nickname the TESO. And the diversion solution, which I give the nickname DISO. The corruption solution, you can guess what that's about, the CORSO. The feminist solution, the FEMSO, and the irony solution, the IRONSO. And a little play on words here, but my conclusion is that I'll explain and go into in detail. The IRONSO is the best of these solutions at honoring Jesus. It resolves the problems better than any of the others do, I believe. It's a strong position, but it's not as well known as many of the others. It's been in the background for too long. So maybe now, in this day and age, with the issues before us, it's time for this position to become better known, because the rest are, pardon the pun here, so-so at best. They don't really solve the problems that I outlined there, the problems that leap off of the page at you. So let's explain a little about each of these solutions. I should say the testing solution is the most common one. The TESO claims that Jesus was testing the woman, drawing out her faith and showcasing her humility. The emphasis is usually on the woman passing the test and becoming a good example. This is the most ancient and common way to interpret the passage. Now, I found an 1844 sermon on this that I think represents the position. I want to read it to you because it ties into the theme of racism rather interestingly, but here it is, Sermon 11 on the passage in mind. King James Version he's using has some strange words there. And here's the sermon. When this woman had thus cried to Jesus, "Lord, have mercy on me," we are told he answered her not a word. His conduct here was very different from what it usually was. But we may suppose, as he knows the heart, that he saw the strength of her faith and therefore tried her, as Abraham was formerly tried, that the trial of her faith might be found unto praise and honor and glory. So that's the emphasis on the testing, the trial. As this woman continued asking our Savior to help her, he spoke as if it would not be fit and proper for him to do so. because she was not of the nation of the Jews. He said, "It is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it to dogs." That is, it is not fit that the Gentiles, who are not God's people, should be benefited by that word and by those miracles, which for the present are intended only for the Jews. And now, did this saying of Jesus drive this woman away from him? No, she would let nothing turn her away from him who alone could help her. And we see how very humble she was and how much she felt her unworthiness. She answered, "Truth, Lord," as much as to say, "I cannot deny it. I am even as a dog, and I have no right to the children's bread." Now do you feel this humble? Do you feel your unworthiness as she did? You must feel in this manner before you can value your Savior and his grace as you ought to. And then you will be able to initially join in the prayer of our communion service. And then he goes on to a communion prayer. "We do not presume to come to this table, O merciful Lord, trusting in our own righteousness, but in thy manifold and great mercies. We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table." "Truth, Lord," said this woman, "I am even as a dog, altogether unworthy of thy favor." But she added, "Yet the dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table," by which she meant that the little favor which she asked was but as a crumb compared with the great blessings bestowed upon the Jews, and might therefore be granted. Now, this sermon came from a collection called Sermons Preached on Plantations, Congregations of Negroes. And this pastor, Reverend Alexander Glenn, would go around to the plantations and considered these gatherings of Black Christians to be his one of his flocks, and he would preach them. And he gathered all these sermons together into this little book and published it in 1844, the proceeds going to the Protestant Episcopal Church and so forth. And there it is for history to show. And so the tone of it is, know your place, be humble, and to emphasize this a little more in terms of this, he had other sermons, of course, in the collection. One of them was from Ephesians 6:7. And just to give you a taste of this, he goes on, "I will now read to you the whole passage out of God's holy word, which is written especially for your instruction." Consider his audience here. "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, with singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service, as to the Lord and not to men. Knowing that whatsoever good thing that man doeth, the same he shall receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free." This passage from the Bible shows to you what God requires from you as servants. And there are many other passages which teach the same things. You should try and remember these parts of the Bible, that you may be able to do your duty and state of life unto which it has pleased God to call you. For although a bad servant may not wish to know what God requires of him, yet a Christian servant will desire to know this and to do his will in everything. Our Heavenly Father commands that you, who are servants, should be obedient to your masters according to the flesh. That is, to your earthly master, the master that you serve here while in the body. Here is the very plain command: servants, be obedient. Be obedient to your masters. Look at that repetition there. And no wonder he was welcome on the plantations. So that's the perspective, that's how this passage can be used. I think it's misusing it to do this. And there's some big problems with it. Jesus didn't go all the way into unclean Tyre. It was considered by the Jews to be an unclean territory, just to test the woman. There was a bigger agenda going on. And I think the interpretive framework should be training the 12, not testing this woman. It was a training mission. And Jesus was dealing with their racism, their ethnocentricity, their problem. So I'll get into that more. The second solution is the diversion. which minimizes the apparent racist words of Jesus, although emphasizes that Jesus used the diminutive Greek word for dogs, making them more pets than unclean outsiders. Such writers sidestep the racism issue and divert attention to other topics. And the problems with this is these diversionary tactics, which are popular with a lot of scholars, by the way, because it goes into the Greek words and so forth, are exemplified by this turn-of-the-century scholar, Alan Hugh McNeill. And I want to read a little from, or summarize some of his stuff back in 1915. He touches on all the various solutions. Jesus was silent, trying her faith is kind of the testing thing. The diversion thing, dogs could be household pets, the diversion there. The corruption, he questioned who really wrote Matthew, that maybe it was someone with those racist perspectives that wrote this story, and he raises that question. The femso, that's the feminist solution we'll get into, which says that the woman changed Jesus's mind. And so he says, well, Jesus struggled with how to answer. The humanity of Jesus was at the forefront. And finally, the irony solution, tries to soften the negative force of Jesus's dog statement. And quoting him, he says, but if the words were audible to her, we may be sure that the half-humorous tenderness of manner would deprive them of all their sting, end quote. This is an example to me of projecting a caricature of Jesus, meek and mild, without providing any specific contextual evidence that it was a half-humorous tenderness of manner. And so I say McNeill is like many commentators on this passage. I see them as theological bumblebees pollinating every possible solution, but they don't take a position and defend it. They just kind of sprinkle their ideas out there as scholars, but they're not usually taking a position and defending it. And that's what I'm trying to do here, is take the position of the irony solution. But the corruption solution, I'm not going to go into this very much at this juncture. It's just you understand this is the perspective that Dr. Badawi used to actually defend Jesus. So some of the scholars think that by saying the scriptures are corrupted, that somehow it makes Jesus look better. And that position is largely diminished over time because the integrity of scripture is determined by textual criticism. In other words, the scholars know what the text actually says. And the feminist solution, which is one of the more interesting ones, they see the woman as a protagonist who wins an argument with Jesus and changes his mind. The humanness of Jesus is emphasized while questioning aspects of his divine nature and sinlessness. This began in the 1980s. About the same time I wrote my paper, feminist authors were addressing this passage, and quite a few articles were written. They focus on this story because it showcases a powerful woman in a dramatic encounter with Jesus, so no wonder. They critique the patriarchal systems in both the ancient biblical cultures and in current male-dominated modern institutions that study and interpret the Bible. So they have some points to make, and we need to listen to them. Not all of the feminist perspective are women, by the way. There are several theologians and scholars who take the position here that are not women, but female voices should define the position. They need to be listened to, and this one in particular. And so I did a lot of study on their perspective, and I have some interesting quotes to share with you from them. Sharon Ringe is one of the first to write on this story. In a book, she wrote a chapter in this book called A Gentile Woman's Story. And her first line in her chapter was, "The church has trouble with uppity women." So she kind of brings it home and identifies with this woman as kind of an uppity woman challenging the status quo, which represented by Jesus. And she also says Jesus was caught with his compassion down, kind of a clever little quote. almost 2 decades later, after she kind of introduced this article, she was asked to submit an updated article in a Feminist companion to Mark. It was a theological book focused on the Gospel of Mark. And so she had it revisited to the original title. So now it's called A Gentile's Woman's Story Revisited. And she comments on the work of several other feminist authors who tackled this story in the intervening almost 2 decades there. And here's what she, in spite of her search for wisdom, she says, at the conclusion of this study, the passage continues to elude me and to leave me perplexed. I remain troubled by the harshness of the language attributed to Jesus, regardless of its political comprehensibility. And so that, you know, it's not like it's a settled issue, but they take the position that the woman was the protagonist and changed the mind of Jesus. But it still troubles him that Jesus would have talked this way. Now, another feminist scholar, Tracy Hartman, wrote a chapter in another compilation, and it's called Jesus, What Were You Thinking? The Canaanite Woman in Matthew 15. And here's a long quote, which is a good one because it critiques the other solutions. And here's what she says. Several theories have been advanced to either justify Jesus's behavior or to place the responsibility for his harsh comments on someone else's shoulders, thereby maintaining his status as a good protagonist in this story. One common response is to try to lessen the severity of Jesus's statement, which I call the Diversion Solution, DISO. This argument takes 2 tracks. In the first, scholars point out that dog was a common derogatory term in Jesus's day to refer to one's enemies, and that Jews used the term for Gentiles. There was no love lost between Jews and Canaanite Gentiles, so Jesus could have been identifying the Canaanite woman as an enemy of the Jews. Following a second track, others point out that the Greek word for dog here is the diminutive form of the word, and that Jesus was calling the woman a little puppy. Some scholars even suggest that Jesus was teasing or joking, with a smile on his face and a twinkle in his eye, removing all the insult and bitterness from his words, which is kind of a part of the iron solution, but they got it wrong. But anyway, they talk about the humor aspect. Numerous problems emerge from these attempts to lessen the force of Jesus's words. Tracy goes on. First, the text gives no indication that Jesus was joking or teasing. Even if this were the case, the jocularity is an inappropriate response given the woman's desperate plea for her daughter's healing. Further, feminists are quick to dismiss the endearing puppy language, remarking that being called little bitch is no better than being called bitch. Interesting, I'm quoting her. Some scholars, she goes on, suggest that Jesus was testing the woman's faith. This is the testing solution, but this theory is problematic. First, if he did want to test her faith, it seems he could have done so without being so harsh. But why test her faith at all? In other healings in the Gospels, Jesus appears to take someone's request for healing as an indicator that they believe he can provide what they need. Some scholars, she goes on, try to give Jesus an easy out and blame the author of the Gospel for this difficult test. These writers suggest that early Jewish Christians who were opposed to the Gentile mission attributed these words to Jesus. This is the corruption solution. Even if this passage was a later addition, it seems like the gospel writers would have been savvy enough to make their point without making Jesus look so bad. Now, finally, the irony solution. The irony solution acknowledges the wit and perception of the woman, who becomes a willing partner with Jesus in using irony to expose and correct the wrong thinking of the disciples. To begin the third and final year of training the 12, Jesus designed this venture into unclean territory to prepare them for the coming Acts of the Apostles, when the church goes global into the whole world at that time. The Iron So uses a precise definition of irony to interpret the intended meaning of Jesus's words and actions to be the exact opposite of his literal words. So let's define irony. The definition, and I went to Wikipedia, dictionaries, and all kinds of sources, but they all pretty much agree with the one that I found back when I wrote my paper from Robert Stein. He defined it as a statement or expression is ironic when its intended meaning is the opposite of the literal meaning of the statement. Now, I'll just comment on this, that I think we use irony a lot in our culture, in our usage of language. When I was raising kids and they were late for school, I'd sometimes say to my daughter, Heather, take your time. You've got all the time in the world. Well, that was irony. She knew we didn't have all the time in the world. She knew she was late, but by saying it in that way was a statement of irony, and it was understood by the context. And so you understand irony by its context, and that's how we're going to explain this as a from the text interpretation, not imposed from the outside, but it springs from the context of what Jesus was doing, his purposes, and it makes better sense than any of these other so-so solutions. The genre of irony can be subgrouped within the broad category of humor, but is distinguished from caustic forms of wit such as sarcasm, satire, and mockery. It is not those negative forms. The irony used here does not include elements of joking or teasing. As Tracy Hartman stated in the quote I read, jocularity is an inappropriate response given the woman's desperate plea for her daughter's healing. So this is not teasing and joking with the woman, but irony, yes, and irony can be put into very serious conditions. Now, here's a quote from Bob Darden. For 20 years, he was a senior editor of the Wittenberg Door, which he describes as the world's largest, oldest, and pretty much only religious satire magazine. I used to read this when I was a youth pastor, and it's quite edgy, the Wittenberg Door. It was, I don't know if it's still being published, but it's kind of like the Mad magazine of Christians. This quote is from his 2008 book entitled Jesus Laughed, the Redemptive Power of Humor. And his take on this is that the entire exchange has obviously been for the benefit of the 12 and all the others who have been following him. That would include us. This isn't funny, ha ha. This is funny, ironic. First, Jesus asks his audience to love their neighbors. Sure, they say, we love them, Lord. But then he puts a face on a neighbor, a hated Canaanite. So that's how he defines irony, really in the bigger picture of the teaching of Jesus. Loving neighbors was a teaching earlier in the Sermon on the Mount. And so he says, is pointing out the contrast, which is the evidence of irony. Context is important, and I'll give you just some examples of the context immediately surrounding this passage. First of all, the bread theme, these crumbs of bread, right? They're sandwiched. The story about bread is sandwiched, pun intended here, between two feeding miracles. The first one in the previous chapter of 5,000, primarily a Jewish gathering, a multitude, and Jesus does the feeding, miraculous feeding of them when they were out there in the wilderness. And then the next chapter, there's another repetition of this miracle. It's mentioned in the same Gospel of Matthew, so it's not telling the story of just one in two ways. It's actually two separate ones in two separate contexts. And the second one follows this story, but it takes place Decapolis or in areas that are outside of Jewish context, and the crowd is described as representing many different ethnicities. And so basically a Gentile crowd. And the feeding miracle is repeated. So it's like a reaffirmation that he is the bread of life for the world. And so the bread theme shows the irony here of how Jesus was freely giving bread, not mere crumbs falling from the table. The cleanliness theme, and this has to do with the unclean territory and the idea of separation between the clean and the unclean people. And he was just teaching before taking his disciples on this journey into the region of Tyre and Sidon, quite a hike over 40, 50 miles, I think, over a mountain range into this region. But just before he took them there, his teaching was about true cleanliness in contrast to the outward washings of the religious leaders of the Jews. And he was saying true cleanliness and uncleanliness comes from the heart. And you can read those teachings in the previous verses that are in both Matthew and Mark. So that's, again, contextual evidence of irony. There's also the faith theme. The theme of faith is prominent because he contrasts little faith and great faith. Within these chapters, right after this, he criticizes his disciples for their little faith, but only 2 times in the Gospels, and they're both mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus praises someone for having great faith. There's a Roman centurion in chapter 8 of Matthew, in which he said, I have not seen such great faith in all of Israel. The faith that was exemplified by this hated Roman occupier of their people. And he holds him up as an example of great faith. And now this woman, representing the hated Canaanite historic enemies, and she is commended for great faith. So these are evidences, again, that contrast necessary to show that he was speaking in irony. Then there's this whole idea of how the Gentiles are looked at and treated. And you go through, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, for example, the story of the wise men from the east, the Magi kings. They recognize Jesus. They come to great distance, a great trouble to honor him, while the Jewish King Herod tried to kill the baby Jesus. So that's kind of the context that this whole drama starts with, is this idea that the Gentiles have greater insight than the Jews many times, and recognize who he is and what his mission is. And then there's the theme of women, and the Gentile women in particular. 4 women were honored in the genealogy of Jesus that starts the Gospel of Matthew. All 4 women are Gentiles in the family line of Messiah Jesus. And one of them was even a Canaanite. That's Rahab the harlot, the heroine of the story of Joshua and the wall of Jericho. And so he's honoring, not shaming, the women and the Canaanites and the Gentiles. And this is the context that shows irony. There are many other examples of this that we could go into, but I think it's good to wrap this up for part 1. Maybe I'll do a part 2. And I'll end it with this quote from Elton Trueblood, who wrote a book in 1964 called The Humor of Christ. And he wrote a book, one of his many books, called The Humor of Christ. And in it, he quotes the scripture there in Matthew 15:26. It's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And he says, if there is a harder problem than this in New Testament interpretation, we do not know what it is. Taken at face value, the sentence is rude and contemptuous. Above all, a person who does not face this problem and who is not worried by it has hardly begun to study the gospel seriously. So I'll leave you with that kind of serious thought and open up to your comments, questions, and also you need to take a vote if you want me to do part 2 and go deeper into the irony solution and critiquing the others too, but mostly it's focused on defense of the irony solution of Bible study.
Bruce, I would excuse me. I would simply say this: I'm impressed with the intelligence and that you went into this. I was going to call my counselor and ask him, why did you put me in an advanced placement class when I asked for a remedial class? I can only say I am so thankful that you're not going to give us a test on this. I don't think I could even answer the first question, but quite an insight. That's all I can say. Anybody else, any other guys, have any comments? There you go.
So a lot to think about. I understand a lot unloaded, kind of the proverbial trying to take a drink out of the fire hydrant kind of thing. And